conference that, where is she? Frances Fox Piven and I, she's sitting way in the back, but you'll see her later today, dreamed up, it's almost a year ago now, in anticipation of a Supreme Court decision that I'm sure you're all aware of that's coming up soon, the Friedrichs case. Well, with the timely demise of one of of Antonin Scalia, that sort of the urgency of that is a little bit less because we think, that's not going to be the sort of turning point that we feared, but other cases are coming, and this is a very important, agenda for the future of the labor movement. I think you all know that union density has been in free fall for decades in the United States, although a little bit less so here in New York than nationally still. It's a serious problem. I'll just throw out a few numbers for those who don't keep up with these things. In 1973, union density in this country was about 24% overall. And in 2015, last year, it was 11%. Here in New York State, it's a little better, 25% approximately, but still. Now, the exception to all this, of course, is public sector unionism. Here in New York, in the state of New York, and the city is similar, 71% of all public sector workers are union members. Nationally, it's only about half that, 35%. But so that's what's left standing. And perhaps for that reason, it's become a target of labor's enemies. And I think the challenge that public sector unions are facing goes way beyond the Friedrichs case, so that's sort of the sort of tip of the iceberg, but a very sharp tip. And so that's really what this conference is about. We are not going to talk primarily about legal cases, though there's a little bit of that, but more about the sort of bigger context, the big picture in which all this has emerged and taken shape and what's coming. So we'll focus not just on public sector unionism, but the public sector as a whole, including but not limited to higher education, which many of us work in that so-called industry. So again, our goal is to sort of broaden the conversation to include historical perspectives on public sector unionism, and we have a very expert speaker on that in this first panel. The implications of this crisis for different population groups, particularly people of color and women. The relationship of austerity politics to financialization. You'll hear about all these topics in this opening panel. And who is behind the recent wave of attacks on public sector unionism, which sometimes, the sort of surface appearance is very different from what's really going on. So that's basically the plan, and we have 3 sessions to offer you today. The first one this morning is more or less what I just outlined, and Josh Freeman, my colleague here at Murphy, will introduce the speakers. Then there's going to be a very delicious lunch offered to you for after that, and then we'll follow with 2 more panels, one of which is sort of stories from the field, practitioners, labor activists, labor officials speaking about specific struggles that have occurred in this sector over the last few years. And then we'll end with some sort of strategic thoughts from our third panel. You all have the program, so I won't rehearse that. So that's basically the plan, and I'm delighted you're all here. Thanks for being here, and I'm going to turn it over to Josh.
Did this mic work? Yes. Well, I want to join Ruth in welcome you all. And this panel, which is entitled Attacks on the Public Sector Labor Movement, really sets the stage for the whole conference. It's about where we are now, what our situation is. And we have 5 fantastic panelists here who I'll introduce in a second. And the format's going to be, each of them is going to talk for about 15 minutes. And in fact, I was told I should be a stern timekeeper, so we're not about 15 minutes, 15 minutes. And then there'll be a little bit discussion among the panelists, and then we'll have plenty of time to throw things open for questions and comments from the audience. So we have a very stellar panel, and I'm going to introduce them in the order they're going to speak, which is also the order they're listed in the program. First will be Joseph Slater, who is Eugene M. Bork Professor of Law and Values at the University of Toledo Law School, where he's been since 1999. He has a PhD in history from Georgetown University, as well as a JD from University of Michigan. Joe's published extensively on the history of public sector labor law. Among other topics, he's a member of the Labor Law Group and the College of Labor and Employment Lawyers. And before coming to University of Toledo, He was a practitioner. He practiced law in Washington, D.C. for over a decade. Our second speaker will be Saqib Bhatti, who is a fellow at the Roosevelt Institute and director of Refund America Project. His work focuses on the kinds of financial deals that have played a large role in the public budget distress, and he has proposed solutions to fix the inefficiencies in municipal finance. He was previously a fellow at the Nathan Cummings Foundation. Before that, he worked in the area of corporate social responsibility for SEIU and the Culinary Workers Local 226. That's the culinary local in Las Vegas. And he graduated from Yale University in 2004. Third will be Gordon Lafer. Gordon is associate professor at the Labor Education and Research Center at University of Oregon. He's been there since 1997. He also came from Yale. He has a PhD in political science. I should say he was also in Las Vegas. Maybe that's the secret bonding thing that connects us. Gordon has moved from both practical work and academic work. In 2009, 2010, he was the senior labor advisor to the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Education and Labor. Prior to coming to Oregon, he worked as a union organizer for the Building Trades Organizing Campaign in Las Vegas and with HERE, the hotel employees and restaurant employees. And Gordon's published on a range of labor and policy issues, and he has a forthcoming book called The 1% Solution, The Corporate Attack on American Labor Standards. Following Gordon, Jennifer Laird's going to be speaking. She is currently completing her PhD at the University of Oregon. University of Washington. Those West Coast places are just they look the same. University of Washington. Her dissertation is entitled Unequally Unemployed, Racial and Ethnic Labor Market Stratification During the Great Recession. And she has written about the impact of cuts in the public sector, specifically on women and people of color. And finally, we'll hear from Harold Meyerson. Harold, in my view, has been the most astute reporter about politics and labor in this country for several decades now. He is editor-at-large at the American Prospect, where he also served as the editor-in-chief. He wrote for LA Weekly. He, until recently, had a column in the Washington Post. And I think many of you have seen his work, which has been published extremely widely. So it's a spectacular panel, and I'm going to hand things over to Joe.
Thank you and good morning. It is a cliche to say I'm honored to be here and to be speaking with this panel, but in this particular case, I really mean it, to be on a panel with people whose work I have admired from afar for years. So thank you to Ruth and the other organizers of the conference for inviting me here. I have been tasked to do two things today, all within 15 minutes. First, to give a brief overview of the history of public sector labor law and labor relations, and then to talk a bit about the Friedrichs case. That's 100 years to do in 15 minutes, but hey, I'm in Manhattan, so I can talk fast, right? All right. One of the things I would add to Ruth's description of the statistics is that between the pretty solid numbers of union density in the public sector and the rather low numbers in the private sector, since the mid-aughts, public sector workers have made up about half of the labor movement. So it is well past time that we can think of this as some sort of niche subject. This is where half of the people who are in labor unions in America are, in the public sector. All right, so the first thing to understand about the big overview of public sector labor relations in the country is that unlike private sector labor relations, this is a matter of state and local law. Private sector labor relations are set by one federal statute, well, if you count the railroad and airline employees too, but they're both federal statutes. Public sector is state and local law, and there are over 100 state and local laws that govern public sector employees in the U.S., and they vary considerably. And there are some states, about 8 or 9 of them, that don't give public sector workers the right to collectively bargain at all. The majority of states don't allow public sector workers to strike at all, none of them. My state of Ohio does, New York doesn't. So the question is, how did we get here to this particular point? Public sector laws came later than private sector laws. The first public sector law, ironically, was in Wisconsin, didn't come until the early 1960s. Some state public sector laws, again, like mine in Ohio, came in the 1980s. The National Labor Relations Act was the 1930s. So what were the reasons why public sector labor relations, especially the law part of it, developed so differently than the private sector version? And apologies to Professor Carroll's students, you're going to get like the 3-minute version of my book here, but here we go. 3 major factors, I think, account for why public sector labor law came so late and developed so unevenly. The first is the Boston police strike, an event that took place in 1919. A number of people were killed. There was chaos in the streets of Boston after a group of police officers went on strike, and they might have had some justification to do so, and if you want to read about it, you can get my book. But the point is, it had a very negative impact on public sector workers after that strike. The strike prompted a series of rules and regulations by public employers across the country, banning unions that were affiliated with the AFL. It cut off an early wave of public sector organizing. Public sector organizing in the teens had actually increased dramatically. Some of the big public sector unions you see today, the American Federation of Teachers, the IAFF, were formed around the time right before the First World War or during that era. That was all cut off, and public sector unions were forever associated, or at least for decades, were associated with this really calamitous event, so that whenever anybody was trying to propose that any public sector workers should have any types of rights, people would say, you can't do that because of the Boston police strike. Even when they weren't police, even when they were employees who had no particular public safety responsibilities, opponents would successfully lobby for rules and regulations and laws that said nobody can organize at all, even though public sector unions said that they weren't going to strike, and even though public sector unions didn't strike, they continued to be barred. Up in the 1980s, when they had the Patco strike, there were still people making references and comparisons to the Boston police strike. A second issue is the federalist structure of American government. In European countries, where their public sector labor laws are much more similar to their private sector labor laws, there's typically a federal government you can lobby for to get one particular type of law passed. In the U.S., because of the 10th Amendment, and I promised Ruth that I wouldn't make this a technical law talk, but if you want to ask me questions, you can ask me questions later. Because of the 10th Amendment, it was pretty clear that a federal law governing all public sector unions simply wasn't going to fly constitutionally, and thus public sector labor laws and rules were made by state and local governments who themselves were the direct employers of labor. And so you can imagine, if you were to ask Henry Ford, is it a good idea to have a policy that Ford workers can organize? He would have probably said no. And even politicians who were in some ways friendly to labor were different when they had their employer hats on. Josh Freeman's book demonstrates in great detail how the LaGuardia who signed the Norris LaGuardia Act was a different LaGuardia than LaGuardia who presided over transit workers' issues in New York State. And then finally, there was this issue that courts and policymakers simply could not comprehend, that public sector unions would behave any differently than private sector unions. They assumed that public sector unions would want to bargain about all of the same things that private sector unions would want to bargain about, some of which seemed like things that maybe democratically elected officials should have control over. And even more importantly, public officials feared that there will be more strikes, just like there was in Boston. And you have some really wild quotes from cases in the 1940s, a decade after the National Labor Relations Act was passed. Two different courts, one from New York State and one from Texas, in 1943 used the following quote: "To tolerate or recognize any combination of employees of the government as a labor organization or union is not only incompatible with the spirit of democracy, but inconsistent with every principle upon which our government is founded." Yes. So this tide finally began to break in the late 50s and 1960s. The private sector labor movement was powerful. There hadn't been any significant strikes in the public sector for many decades. The first law was passed in Wisconsin in the 60s. Many more states passed their laws. There were a number of contributing factors to that: the militancy of the era, again, the power of the labor movement, declining relative wages in the public sector. And by the 70s, the majority of states, a clear majority of states, about 2/3, had laws that gave at least some of their public employees the rights to collectively bargain. But it has always remained contested. Again, even today, even before the debates of 2011, a number of states don't give collective bargaining rights to anyone, to any public employees. And a number of states limit severely what public employees can bargain. And the vast majority of states don't permit public sector employees to strike. One more background rule that helped the expansion of public sector unions in the 1960s. In the 1960s, the Supreme Court ruled for the first time that firing or disciplining an employee because he or she supported a union was a violation of that employee's First Amendment rights. Unions had been arguing that point unsuccessfully since the beginning of the 20th century. Finally, in the 1960s, the Supreme Court bought it, which means, and this is still the rule today, most public sector employees have a constitutional right to join a union, to be a member of a union, meaning they can't be fired or disciplined for doing that. But that constitutional right does not extend to bargaining, and it certainly doesn't extend to strikes. So that's a quick Cook's tour through the last century of public sector history. I'd be happy to talk more about any of that during the questions. But now I want to get into the Friedrichs case. And this is going to be a little on the law side, but I'll try to keep it simple as I can. All right, so there's two cases I want to talk about, and then the background to them. The case that Ruth was referring to, Friedrichs versus California Association of Teachers, had some history. The history begins with a case from 1977 called, 1977, excuse me, called Abood versus Detroit Board of Education. That case involved a challenge to a union security clause. As most of you probably know, a union security clause means a clause in a union contract that obligates a member of a union bargaining unit to pay some portion, at least, of union dues to the union to cover the cost of representing that employee. In Abood, the plaintiffs brought a First Amendment challenge to this. You are making us pay for things we don't want to pay for, from politics to just the whole fact that you are a union. Abood upheld, in a limited way, the constitutionality of union security clauses. Abood held that plaintiffs could be required to pay those costs that went to the costs of representing them, activities related to collective bargaining in the court's term, but they could not be required to pay dues that went to activities not related to collective bargaining. Biggest categories of activities related to collective bargaining: contract negotiation, grievance handling, strikes, that sort of thing. Biggest category of activities not related to collective bargaining is politics. Abood justified this system by saying the government had an interest in the exclusive representation model, as opposed to saying having a lot of minority unions running around with different contracts for different parts of the workforce, and also that the government had to balance the First Amendment rights of the employees against the union's obligation under the duty of fair representation to represent all of its members fairly. Again, this is probably a legal rule that most of you know, but unions are required to represent fairly and without discrimination members of union bargaining units, even if those members of the union bargaining units do not pay dues. So, balancing these concerns, they upheld the idea of what is typically called an agency shop or a fair share shop. Now, states can still choose to make agency shops illegal. That's what right to work means, that any type of obligation in a union contract that makes union members pay even for the cost of their representation is illegal in right to work states. New York and Ohio are not right to work states. The state I was born in, Michigan, sadly now is. All right, and the last rule that is relevant here for the discussion of Harris and Friedrichs is that subsequent cases also held that to exercise this right not to pay for tasks that are 2 minutes? No, I have not been in. All right, so opt out. Really? I can't tell time. Okay, so Friedrichs. Friedrichs and Harris were both cases that involved challenges to this system, and one of the in which again people were challenging Abood. And what they held in what the plaintiffs wanted in Abood was what plaintiffs wanted in both Harris, which was 2014, and Friedrichs, which was this year. What they wanted was a rule that said we're going to reverse Abood and make, as a matter of constitutional law, the entire public sector right to work. The intermediate position that they asked for was to change the current system, which is if you want to object to paying parts of your union dues, you have to affirmatively object, an opt-out system. Plaintiffs said, no, instead of that, the First Amendment requires an opt-in system. In Harris, the Supreme Court, which was a 2014 case, which the National Right to Work Committee brought and wanted to have all these results happen, the Supreme Court basically dodged the issue by saying that the employees in Harris who were state home health care workers were not true public employees. They were joint employees. They were employees of the state, but also employees of the individual private citizens who were employing them to do home health care. So they were a special category. So it was a very narrow ruling, but there was a lot of language in the Harris decision that made union people worry that Abood was at risk, especially Scalia, who at one point seemed fairly sympathetic to the free rider argument, but in later decisions became less so. Okay, so then surprisingly to some and worryingly to people on the union side, in the Friedrichs case, they decided to take up basically the same issue. You know, should we overturn Abood and make the whole public sector right to work as a matter of constitutional law? Should we make this an opt-out system, an opt-in system as opposed to an opt-out system? But there was no question that the employees in Friedrichs, who were public school teachers, were real public employees. After the oral argument in Friedrichs, I would say the union side was very worried that Scalia was going to vote the other way because Harris had been a 5-4 decision and you only needed to switch one vote to reverse Abood. So everybody was worried. Everybody was making preparations. Some people were organizing conferences. The Justice Scalia died, about which I will say every man's death diminishes me, but some more than others. So where does this leave us? Well, it's now pretty clearly 4-4. If the result in Friedrichs is 4-4, as with any other Supreme Court decision, it's going to be 4-4, and it looks like there's going to be a lot of them. It will uphold the lower courts. The lower court in this case was the Ninth Circuit. The Ninth Circuit ruled in favor of the unions against plaintiffs, which it had to do because Abood was still the precedent. So the court could issue a 4-4 decision. It could decide to hold it over until a new justice is appointed. But at least for the time being, labor has dodged that bullet. But, and I will really finish up with 2 very quick points, there's other bullets that labor isn't dodging as successfully, one of which is states simply passing right-to-work laws, right? Because you don't need a constitutional ruling for Michigan to go right to work. You don't need a constitutional ruling for West Virginia to go right to work. And other laws that say state laws that say things like you can't use dues checkoff, you can't use dues deduction to fund political purposes. So labor is still fighting these battles very much. So the Friedrichs is a victory, I guess, in the sense that many labor victories of the last couple of decades have been things aren't immediately going to get much worse, but it could have been a lot worse. Thank you.
Good morning. So again, I'd like to start by thanking Ruth, Francis, everyone here at the Murphy Institute for inviting me to speak this morning. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what's actually happened in the public sector as our economy has changed and what that means for public sector bargaining. If you've been wondering what this slide is about, well, it's this presentation. So I'm going to start with some stuff that basically I'm sure everyone sort of knows, right? So like since the mid-1970s, real wages have basically been frozen, but the cost of living has continued to go up. So can someone tell me how people made ends meet? Debt, right? You borrow. State colleges in this country used to largely be free. At the same time that wages have stagnated, we've started raising tuition for students. How do students make ends meet? Debt, right? Like there's a pattern here. So similarly, we've also seen in the public sector, basically since 1980 or so, we've seen tax rates on corporations and high income earners really decline at the same time that we've had the greatest need for infrastructure investment and upgrades in the country because of just the amount of growth. And once again, the way that we've made ends meet is debt. Really, what's happened systematically in all parts of the economy over the last 35, 40 years is that debt has replaced income. Governments, we're no longer getting paid the money that we actually need. Instead, we're just borrowing it from the financier class, and we're paying it back to them with interest. Right? And so as debt has skyrocketed in the country since the 1970s, and as that's happened, we've seen bank profits just soar, right? So this happens when you do a PowerPoint at 2 in the morning. You get the order of the slides wrong, right? So that's this slide. So we've seen, bank profits just completely soar, right? This is financial sector profits going back to World War II, but we start to see that in the mid-1970s, they start to rise precipitously. And what's actually happened now is that roughly a third of corporate profits in the U.S. come from the financial sector, even though it only employs about 1% of the workforce. Right? There's a huge outsized role that the financial sector plays in our economy. And so, in fact, there is now so much debt that banks have actually adjusted their business model. As we saw sort of debt start to explode, banks, in the past, they actually used to make the money primarily from interest income, right? Which was you make interest off the loans, the money that you lend out, and that's where your profits come from. Well, what we've seen over the last 30 years or so is a shift from interest income to fee-based income. So what that means is that instead of holding on to the loans and charging interest rates, instead what the banks do is they make the loans, they charge a fee for making the loan, they then securitize it, they package up, securitize it, sell it off in the secondary market, they charge fees for every step along the way, and then they service the loans and they charge fees for servicing the loans themselves. And in fact, it creates a situation where not only do they not care about the quality of the loans because they won't be the ones receiving the payments, but in some cases they actually have incentives to sell bad loans because they can charge more fees. Because if you're late on a payment, they can charge a late fee. If you go into foreclosure, they can charge foreclosure fees. There's all sorts of fees they can charge because at the end of the day, what they care about is quantity, not quality. And so as that's happened, this is what led to things like the predatory mortgage crisis, right? We basically saw banks that their main thing was they wanted to make sure that they had deal volume, so they came up with new products so that they can sell loans to as many people as possible. They didn't care about underwriting standards. They didn't care about whether the homeowner would actually be able to pay the loan back. In many cases, they sold people loans that were unaffordable to them, even though they qualified for affordable loans. And that was particularly done with communities of color. This shift, and we call this predatory lending, right? And so, like, why am I talking about predatory lending? It's because the exact same thing has happened in the public sector with municipal finance. In much the same way that banks targeted cash-strapped, homeowners, low-wage workers with payday loans, they've also targeted cities and states with predatory municipal finance deals that have high costs, hidden risks, they're overly complex, and often they're designed to fail. And so, just to give you a little bit of background on how this happened. So since Reagan, really, there's been a dramatic shift in tax policy in this country. This is where I go back a couple of slides. So first, we've shifted. All that matters here is the lines, right? And basically, we've had this big shift, which is that we've replaced. There's a shift from corporate taxes to individual taxes, right? So if you look at the share of taxes over time, back in 1934, it's roughly equal, but now a much larger share of taxes comes from the individual side, much less from the corporate side. Secondly, there's been a big shift to really reduce tax in the highest income taxpayers at the individual level. And we've seen both of these trends also mirrored at the state level with state taxes. And so what that means, in effect, what we've done is we've shifted the tax burden more and more to the people with the least ability to pay it, right? Because we're not charging corporations nearly as much, we're not taxing high income earners nearly as much. And so as I said, we did this at the exact same time that we had the greatest need for investment in the country. And so what we saw as a result is that total outstanding municipal debt has really grown tenfold since 1980. In 1980, total municipal bonds, which is state and local government borrowing, was under $400 billion. Now it's close to $4 trillion, right? This huge growth that was not there beforehand. And so, just to be clear, there's a whole fix the debt crowd that sort of says debt is bad because they want to push an austerity agenda. And that's not true. Like, long-term borrowing for long-term capital projects is a good thing. It makes a lot of sense. However, a lot of this borrowing was driven by budget shortfalls, where basically cities and states borrowing to make ends meet because they didn't have enough revenue coming in. And that is really problematic. That's basically, and in many cases, what they're doing is they're borrowing to pay debt payments, right? They're actually borrowing to pay off the credit card, that's actually really problematic. And so the thing is, when cities borrow, the investors in municipal bonds are largely high wealth individuals because municipal bonds because they're tax exempt, they have a lower rate of return, and really the primary market for them is high wealth individuals that use it as a tax shelter. And so what that means is that basically, instead of paying their fair share in taxes, the wealthy are able to lend us their tax dollars instead, and we have to pay it back to them with interest, right? Secondly, when we take out all these financial deals, we had to pay fees to banks at every step along the way. And so this means that with every single transaction, you have a set of banks that get their cut. They get to extract profit from every single piece of borrowing that goes on. And so this incentivizes them to sell public officials more complex and risky products. And in fact, there's this thing where they've developed more complex, exotic, risky products just so they can then also sell you additional products to mitigate that risk, right? So it's like they say, well, take out a variable rate debt. It has all these risks, but you can mitigate those risks by taking out a swap, but that has some risk. Then you need a letter of credit on top of that, and you can buy all those things from us. It begs the question, why don't we just buy use a fixed rate bond? Because at the end of the day, when you actually add in all the fees for all of those things, it costs you just as much. The only difference is instead of that money going to bondholders, banks are getting a larger cut out of it. And the city is taking on much more risk as a result. And so as with predatory mortgages, all of this eventually came tumbling down for many cities and states that happened in 2008 with the financial crisis. As a result, taxpayers lost billions of dollars. Just to give an example of this, so one of these deals that was really problematic is something that we call, it's called interest rate swap. We call it a toxic swap because that's sexier than interest rate swap. That's really why. But the Detroit Water Department had many of these toxic swaps. And so basically these deals backfired in '08 when the economy crashed and Detroit's credit rating got slashed several times. And in 2012, they had to terminate most of these deals and pay $537 million in penalties on the deals. Well, that's $500 million the Detroit water system did not have. And so what did they do? They actually ended up borrowing in order to pay off those payments. As a result, water bills doubled. Right, so now 40% of Detroiters' water bill goes towards paying back the penalties on the swaps that were backfired in 2012. And so when they're shutting off water in tens of thousands of people, the reason why people can't afford their water bills is because the money is going to pay off these swaps. If we look at the lead poisoning in Flint, well, the stated justification for switching off of Detroit, Flint used to be on the Detroit water system. The justification for switching off of Detroit water was it had become too expensive. Why had it suddenly become too expensive? Because of the swap payments, right? And so really, if we think about this, what does this mean for public sector unions? Sort of three things. So first, when a city or state has a lot of debt or bad financial deals, public officials' top priority is always to pay back that debt. So workers in public services are considered discretionary spending. Debt is always considered mandatory, right? You have to pay it back first. So for an example, so I live in Chicago. The state of Illinois is now 9 months into a budget stalemate where there has been no budget, no appropriations for spending. Basically, the state budget, the state spending is being done by court order. Only things that the court orders gets paid. And so it means that there's the state's not giving money to students for financial aid grants. They're not paying social service providers. They're talking about closing schools and even state universities. But at the same time that these payments aren't being paid, banks are actually being paid on the 1st and 15th of every single month, even though it's actually illegal to pay them because there's no appropriation for that either. But they make a point to pay them. Workers and services get cut, but banks get paid first, banks and creditors. Right, so secondly, we're starting to see how the financial class is actually using debt as a union-busting tool. So many state constitutions specifically protect a public worker's pension benefits. So the big precedent from the Detroit bankruptcy is that cities, school districts, and other municipalities can use federal bankruptcy law to get around those constitutional protections and slash pensions and break union contracts. Right? So now places that have a lot of debt often have huge unfunded pension liabilities because when cities are going on a borrowing spree to make ends meet, they're also taking pension holidays, which is in effect borrowing from their workers, right? And so increasingly, what we're seeing is that the right is calling for municipal bankruptcy in places that have a lot of debt, in particular pension debt, because that's the way they can break the union. So in Chicago, so Illinois currently does not allow municipalities to file bankruptcy. Chapter 9 under the Federal Bankruptcy Code allows bankruptcy, but only if your state authorizes it. 26 states, including Illinois, don't. So bankruptcy is not an option. But Governor Rauner, who's himself a finance guy, who's a private equity firm manager, he has a big push now to sort of change that law because he wants to push Chicago public schools into bankruptcy so that he can slash the pensions and break the Chicago Teachers Union. And he's really using CPS's large debt load as a justification without ever sort of stopping to consider why CPS has to take out so much debt in the first place, which of course is because Illinois has the 5th most regressive tax system of any state in the country with a constitutional flat tax. That means that the billionaire governor has one of the lowest tax rates of any person in the state, right? And so finally, like my last point, which is that when unions are at the bargaining table, so this is a question, when we're at the bargaining table, what do we hear from city and state officials? Why can't they fund our bargaining proposals? What do they say? Debt, but also no money, right? They say there's no money. Is that true? No. Well, I'd say it actually is true. In many cases, there isn't money, right? But it's because the money is with the banks, the corporations, the billionaires that aren't paying their fair share in taxes. They've made a choice to pay them and give them the money. And it actually is true that our public budgets, governments actually are pretty much cash starved because they've made those choices already. And so in bargaining, the boss tells us, well, they can't give us a raise unless they slash community services, they pit workers against community members. And there's actually an element of truth to that, to what they're saying, because there really isn't that much extra money in there. So if we're just bargaining with the mayor or the governor, too often we're simply bargaining over the degree of austerity we're willing to accept. It's defensive bargaining to stop bad things from happening. A victory is if we don't have to take any concessions, or if the concessions are minor, right? That's how we define victory these days, which is problematic. But so what if we expand the scope of bargaining to say, well, instead of just fighting the mayor or the governor, we need to actually follow the money up the food chain. The mayor doesn't have the money to give us it doesn't have enough money to both fund contracts and public services. But what if we actually take on the billionaires, the major corporations, the banks that do have that money, right? That can be a way we can go on offense in bargaining to tell the story of where the money has gone, to name the villains and put forth demands to make them pay to fully fund both workers and services. And by doing that, we can shift the narrative in our contract fights and make common cause with the broader community instead of being pitted against them. So just a very quick example, because I have 1 minute to go, so the city workers in Los Angeles, led by SEIU and AFSCME, were in contract bargaining. The contract expired in 2013, and they finally settled in 2014. Expired in 2014. They settled it last year. And so instead of doing traditional bargaining, they actually invited community organizations to join them at the bargaining table and put forth bargaining proposals about improving community services. And so they backed it up with a report that showed that as the city had slashed 5,000 jobs since the financial crash, city services of all stripes had actually significantly deteriorated, right? This is all 2008 to 2013, services all going down. And they found that at the same time, the city actually annually in publicly disclosed fees to banks pay $334 million a year. And that's just publicly disclosed fees. That's not principal or interest in any loans. It's just banking fees. And they found that basically this was double the street services budget for the entire city. Right? So very quickly, the campaign slogan became money for our streets, not Wall Street. And it completely changed the tone of the contract campaign. All the press coverage that they got was about how city workers were demanding that the city get back the money from the banks. And it wasn't just a talking point, it was actually true. And in the end, they won a terrific settlement where they got a commitment to restore the 5,000 jobs that had been lost since 2008. They won a jobs commission so that would put policies in place to make sure that communities of color actually have access to those jobs, which historically was not the case. And they won a funded revenue commission that would look at ways to get money back from banks, renegotiate fees, and find new progressive revenue. And so by taking on Wall Street and going on offense together with community allies, we can actually win victories even in difficult bargaining environments in the face of budget deficits. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Ruth, for organizing which is already a really fascinating conference, and thank you for inviting me. I feel very honored to be on such an esteemed panel. So I am a demographer by training, so I will be talking about how the recent contraction of the public sector has affected different groups, men and women, blacks and whites. I'll also be talking about Hispanics. Kind of continuing the spirit of doom and gloom, I look forward to the afternoon panels, which hopefully will provide us with more reason for optimism. So, given the demography of the public sector, we would expect that if I contract the public sector, some groups will be affected more than others. So here, these are the percent of all employed workers who are working in the public sector. I have men on the left, women on the right. The top lines are black for each plot. So you can see that in general, as we many in this room know, women are overrepresented in the public sector, and particularly black women. So if I have a workforce, I'm going to shrink it. We would expect that women, and particularly black women, would be affected more than others. But there's also evidence to suggest that even within the public sector, there are disproportionate experiences with the contraction. So here I'm showing these are just employment rates among public sector workers. Again, men on the left, women on the right. And you can see that after the recent financial market collapse, as we've already talked about, municipalities are in crisis. You have the black female public sector employment is in free fall. So that's the bottom line on the far right. And I'll talk in this a little bit later about potential reasons for these trends and potential explanations. So there are some that have argued to me, I don't think anyone in this room would make this argument, well, the public sector is like less than a fifth of the total workforce. This is a small share of the economy. What difference does this really make? So the two plots on the left are actual employment rates. The top one is women, the bottom one is men. And then on the right, I do this hypothetical example where I hold public sector employment at its 2003 level. So what if we had kept the same public sector employment rate in 2003? And these are employment rates for everyone, private and public sector workers. But the point of this is to show the story is in the top right plot. Because what you see is that if you hold public sector employment at its 2003 level, employment rates, these are, again, overall employment rates for white women and black women would be significantly higher. So again, holding it at the 2003 level, the overall employment rate for white women would be 3.3 percentage points higher. The overall employment rate for black women would be 4.3 percentage points higher. So the shifts in the public sector labor force have far-reaching consequences. So some of the potential explanations that I've heard are, well, maybe this is, it's not real race differences that we're looking at, but race differences in education or race differences in occupation. So we know that among teachers, for example, black women are less likely to have a master's degree than white women. So you could imagine, okay, a lot of pressure to cut the workforce. I'll keep the those with a master's degree, they'll be harder to replace. You could also imagine that, well, maybe it's the administrative workers who are most vulnerable to public sector layoffs. So in a few slides, I'll show you how after I take that into account, that yes, black women are overrepresented in secretarial occupations, and yes, having a master's degree as a teacher is protective against a layoff, there are still sizable differences that we can't explain. The other issue I'll talk about is what happens to workers after they leave the public sector. So is it that white workers are more likely to enter the private sector? Is it that white workers are more likely to go back in the public sector? And I'll also discuss what happens when people, or the differential rates of leaving the labor force altogether and how that affects the numbers that we're seeing. And finally, there could be some discrimination or other force that I can't measure at the point of hire, at the point of fire, throughout these labor market transitions. So bear with me, I'll explain this plot in detail. What I've done here is so I have a lot of data on public sector workers, and I can control for everything. So that means I can say, okay, I'm going to create a hypothetical situation where I give all black men and all white men the same average level of education. I'm going to give them the same occupational distribution. And then I'm going to control for the fact that blacks are concentrated in the South and regional differences. And I'm going to control for age, which is an important factor here because age is highly correlated with tenure. And we know that public sector layoffs are driven in part by tenure differences. And so I say, once I kind of create this hypothetical situation where everyone has what we call the same observable characteristics, then what are the differences in the predicted probability of employment? So these are predicted probabilities of employment for public sector employees. Again, men on the left, women on the right, black workers are the lower lines. And these white gaps in between the two lines are what statistically are the unexplained differences between these two groups. So even after I take into account the observable differences between black public sector workers and white public sector workers, I take into account that some are concentrated at the local level, state, federal level. Those white gaps are what I just can't explain. So here, what I'm going to talk about now is what happens to people after they leave the public sector. So the people that I plug into this plot are all unemployed public sector workers. And I observe them in my data from 1 month to the next. So given that you're unemployed at time 1, what's the probability that you'll go into one of 4 outcomes? So each column is an outcome. The first column is the probability that you'll stay unemployed the next month. The next column is the probability that you'll leave the labor force altogether. That means you're not even looking for work anymore. The third column is that you go back into the public sector. And then the far right column is that you transition into the private sector. So there's a couple takeaways from these plots. First, you can see that most workers stay unemployed from 1 month to the next. So it's hard to get out of unemployment. But the second is the middle black bars represent black workers. And you can see that for both men and women, black unemployed public sector workers are more likely to stay unemployed from 1 month to the next. The second column, the differences are small, but you see that black women and black men are more likely to leave the labor force altogether. So that means they're not even looking for work. And so then that's what concerns me, actually, is because then we stop tracking them. We stop tracking their employment. They don't show up in a lot of employment rate descriptions because they've just left the labor force altogether. You can see that among women, white unemployed public sector workers are more likely to go back into the public sector. Same is true for men. And then transitioning into the private sector, you can see that for both groups, men and women, so again, that's that middle bar, blacks are the least likely to find private sector employment. So I argue that these race gaps persist even after I take into account all the observable differences between these workers. I think there's a pretty grim outlook for minority public sector workers. We see really low rates of private sector entry. We see relatively high rates of labor force exit. And what's clear is that any further efforts to dismantle the public sector will most likely have a negative effect on the workers who have historically gained the most from public sector employment. Now, the slide I will end on, and if you're close to a screen, this will be interesting perhaps. If you're far away, you're going to get mad at me, so that's okay. I'll tell you what you need to take away from this, and I can use the slides. So, as we talked about earlier on this panel, a lot of this depends on what is going on at the state and local level. Up until now, I've been talking about everything in an aggregate way. And so I've looked at, okay, how does this vary by state? The plot that a lot of people will be interested in is the far top left corner. This is Wisconsin. And so the bottom line is employment rates for public sector blacks. The top line is employment rates for public sector whites. Men and women are all in one group here. You can see that even before 2011, but beginning in 2009, black public sector employment in Wisconsin is in free fall. Now, you can compare that to, so the bottom, some of the bottom plots are for states in the South, so Georgia, South Carolina, Louisiana, Alabama. There seems to be a protective effect for black public sector workers of being in the South. And I'm sure a lot of people in this room have ideas about what's going on here, and I welcome your input. But I think there's a lot more work to be done, at least from a demographer's point of view, about what's going on, regional differences and state level differences. And why living in some places is far more protective than others. So thank you very much.
Do people want to stretch for 1 minute? This is a long panel. No talking. Don't go anywhere. Just get up, stretch, and sit down, okay? Okay, that's enough. Sit down. Okay, down, 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 down. All right, well, like the other panelists, I am delighted to be here. I have to say, when Fran and Ruth asked me to be here, I had a little hesitation because whereas all of the previous speakers here are, brilliant specialists in their particular fields, I am not a specialist in any of this. One of the tricks of journalism is you don't really have to be a specialist. You just have to write fast. And I take my credo from Daniel Bell, who once said, "I specialize in generalities." So that's what I do. Before I get started, by the way, in addition to reading Joe's thing on the sort of whence public sector unions and whence the opposition of public sector unions in the 1919 police strike. There's also a remarkable novel that came out about that several years ago, The Given Day by Dennis Lehane, which is set in Boston in 1919 about a lot of things, but the police strike and the loss of Babe Ruth to the New York Yankees are the central subjects of this remarkable novel. it seems to me that even before the horrendous things that have befallen public sector workers and public sector unions in recent years, even before any of us were really aware of ALEC, it should have been somewhat clear that public sector unions were, as it were, cruising for a bruising. And the reason for that is that, there has been this huge gap that has opened up between the rate of unionization in the public sector and the rate of unionization in the private sector. As Ruth said in her introductory remarks, the overall rate of unionization today is about 11%, but it's about 3 times that in the public sector. So what is it in the private sector? I think it's 6.6%. Well, think about that for a minute. That means that in the private sector, unions have effectively vanished, except in a few sectors, except in a few places like this city, and that some of the things we rightly associate with union membership, like defined benefit pensions, have all but vanished from the private sector. So if anyone really wants to take out against public sector unions, there's a really, really rather obvious way to do it one way or another. The argument is, why are you paying taxes to support people who have better benefits than you? And as the rate of private sector unionization continued to plummet, and that of public sector unions was for a long time, and still in many ways pretty stable, this should have been like a red light that was flashing, or in a sense, public sector unions might have been like, Wile E. Coyote, who's running along, and only when he looks down is he aware that there is nothing under his feet. This is a very unstable condition, which has left public sector unions, I think, generally vulnerable. So I'm going to talk a little. There was some questions after all these specialists and really gave brilliant talks, what was left for me to talk about as a reporter. So I'm going to talk about 2 things. First of all, the response of public sector unions, in particular to the crisis that they were facing with Friedrichs, which is not abated, but which, you could hear in Washington, where I work, sort of an audible sigh of relief when news of Antonin Scalia's death came. But what they were doing that was different as they faced really an existential crisis, and then a little more discussion about the broader political context in which all of this is going on. So I spent some time talking to folks at 3 of the 4 really mega public sector unions in the United States, those being AFSCME, American Federation of State, County, Municipal Employees, the AFT, the American Federation of Teachers, and Service Employees International Union, SEIU, which is a union that is more or less half public sector, half private sector. From all 3, I got, how to put this, somewhat canned answers when you talk to the relatively high level of officialdom, and that's okay. Any organization has a policy which, they hope is in fact bears some relation to what's actually going on, and then to some other folks too. Now, basically, what all of the unions said, one way or another, the specific challenge they faced was if Friedrichs, in fact, were upheld by 5 justices on the Supreme Court, they would all lose a chunk of money, a major chunk of money, from people who had been paying agency fees, who had been not members, but required, going back to the Abood decision that Joe talked about, required to pay a certain amount of funding into the unions to cover the cost of administrating the contract, which covered them as people who were in that jurisdiction, even though they weren't members. So they were all facing a huge financial hit. led to some interesting things. So, some of the unions realized that in some locals and some places, actually, these people were not paying significantly less already than their members who got, other benefits. So part of the sales pitch was, well, hey, as long as you're essentially paying the whole thing, why don't you become a member as well, and you can get X, Y, and Z. But more broadly, they all had, I think, a common analysis, which I think is common to private sector unions as well as public sector unions, which is that, well, we don't really communicate with our members all that well. And as someone who has reported on unions for a very long time, I'd have to say they're right. So, people talking about a disconnect in communications at AFSCME, that we realized we weren't talking that well to our members in SEIU, and so on and so on and so on. So the mantra generally is the realization that, it's not sufficient to send out mailings, it's not sufficient to do a phone bank. We really need one-on-one talks with dedicated members or union staffers and our members, or in this case, the folks who are paying into the agency fee. They don't really have a good sense of what they're doing. What the union is doing, we want to sit down with them and talk. And to a rather remarkable degree, and you can understand the level of real fear that gripped these unions, they set up very ambitious programs, and to a large degree realized a good share of those programs to talk to their unions. I think AFSCME probably did the most of all. I don't really have demographics on the specific unions. Those are hard to come by. I suspect of these three unions in the public sector, AFSCME may have the highest share of minority members and minority agency fee payers. And AFSCME really did a huge job. They essentially have signed up. This is a combination of new members they get generally and agency fee payers who are persuaded to join the union. So in the last 2 years, they've essentially signed up close to 200,000 new members. This isn't a union whose membership is probably on the order of 1.7 million, having held hundreds and hundreds of training events for activist members and staffs on how to talk to these folks. That's what they talk about. What they, but there's also beyond the one-on-one stuff, which they've avidly promoted. They pretty much got anyone they could on staff of any place to do phoning. There was actually a phone bank for AFL-CIO staffers, since AFSCME is a big deal at the AFL-CIO. And people I know were, working from 5 to 8 every night in the National AFL-CIO headquarters, calling a list of AFSCME agency fee payers. This is the kind of stuff that's going on. AFT. Now, is CUNY AFT? Yeah, that's what I figured. AFT was an interesting situation. That of course, is one of the two main teacher unions. The one union I didn't talk to is National Education Association. In AFT, they quickly discovered that among their teachers of K through 12, almost all of them were actual members. Very few agency fee payers among their K through 12 members, roughly 96%, in fact, which is huge. Where it goes down is, higher ed. Where the rate of membership was only 80%. And they had close to altogether maybe 100,000 out of their 1.6 million members, about 100,000 folks who were just agency fee payers and not real members. Why the lower rate in higher ed, in colleges, community colleges, four-year colleges, grad schools, universities? A lot of it is that there's a lot of churn, particularly when we're talking about groups that they're trying to organize more recently, adjuncts, graduate students. You may have, a terrific local by November of the academic year, and then 30% of them leave after May, and your rate goes down. So there's an issue there. And I was told that AFT has about 3,500 locals, but that almost all their agency fee payers, 85% of their agency fee payers, are concentrated in just 88 of these 3,500 locals, which is to say these are colleges, universities. So that was where their challenge was. And AFT then, in discussing this with several people there, one thing became clear, and to their credit made this sort of remarkable, I thought, admission. We were basically just talking here, not particular characterization of the individual unions, but just sort of the way institutions work. Some things they talk about, some things institutions don't talk about. But, what I basically heard was, well, we have 3,500 locals, and we have this great national program, and some of them actually pay attention to it. And a lot of them don't particularly. So their rate of signing up these agency fee payers varies greatly. And in some ways, the most successful is here, K-12, right here in New York City, where the local is the United Federation of Teachers, where they've actually cut down the number of agency fee payers below 100, which is really pretty remarkable. Others, they concede, not so great. Moving on to SEIU, which in many ways is, in some ways, a place where I originally come from, California, in some ways the main public sector union there, as you asked me, is in most eastern states. They've been able to sign up about 80,000 agency fee payers in this period of pre-Friedrichs panic that all the unions, these public sector unions, went through. One of the points they make, sort of an interesting point in terms of the relative appeal of unions. Okay, why should I join a union? And as you know, or you may know, SEIU has been the moving force behind the whole Fight for 15 minimum wage campaigns around the country. It began here in New York with New Yorkers for Community Change, a successor group to ACORN with SEIU backing, and it spread beyond any of their I think, wildest expectations, with the exception of one expectation, which is that at the end of the day, they could maybe get a union contract with McDonald's. That seems to have receded over the horizon. Some of us thought it was always over the horizon. But they have nonetheless persuaded any number of city governments and occasional state governments to raise a minimum wage. And they found in doing a sales pitch with their agency fee payers, the quote was, "Our large goals are a more effective conversation than talking about collective bargaining issues," which makes a certain amount of sense, particularly since a normal person, which union members and non-union members both are, a normal person would be aware of the minimum wage fights to a certain degree, and the arcana of collective bargaining issues might elude them entirely. So that makes a certain amount of sense. Now, I want to say all this emphasis on the one-on-one stuff. I've covered the New Hampshire primary. I've been doing this for time immemorial. And there's a case where, most unions support a single candidate, one particular candidate, and knock themselves out for that candidate. And what did we see in New Hampshire this year? It wasn't their candidate who prevailed among union or non-union voters, although there's one exception in a place where there was one-on-one talking in a sort of a large factory town, large by New Hampshire standards, with the members, where there was a very heavy vote for the union-endorsed candidate. The point here is I am not talking about 2016 Hillary Clinton, Bernie Sanders. I'm talking about 1984, Gary Hart, Walter Mondale. And, you know, labor came away with this huge revelation, this flashing light out of 1984, that the only place where they actually got union members to vote for the union-endorsed candidate, Walter Mondale, who was endorsed by the entire AFL-CIO at that point, was Berlin, which is the way they pronounce Berlin, in northern New Hampshire, where there was a large paper mill, and they got the workers to, how many minutes is that? Two. They got the workers to, in fact, after one-on-one conversations, vote for Walter Mondale. Why am I mentioning this? Because the fact that unions rediscover at every crisis point the value of having activist members who can actually talk to other people, and why they forget this when this, when the crisis has abated, is an ongoing mystery and challenge. Let me conclude with some larger political points. Fiscal constraints to the contrary notwithstanding, you're going to find more sympathy for unions in cities than states. Right now, of the 30 largest American cities, 27 have Democratic mayors. Some of them are anti-union stunks. Some of them are decidedly pro-union, very progressive. This 27 out of 30 is the greatest partisan imbalance since whatever. You know how many states are controlled by Democrats these days? By which I mean both houses of the legislature and no, two. Seven, of which only one is big, California. One of the things unions do, of course, and I would add this to Gordon's presentation, unions, particularly the big public sector unions, concentrate a lot on boosting core Democratic voter turnout. SEIU is particularly, I think, adept, given its geography, in working in Latino areas. All the unions, particularly AFSCME and SEIU, work in inner city African American communities. And when, but even they and other forces have yet to boost Democratic turnout-based voters during midterm elections. So as states move right, cities move left. Some cities have the authority to actually do some decent economic stuff. They can raise the minimum wage without the state clamping down on them. Increasingly, we see a fight between progressive cities, reactionary states, and then on top, a gridlocked federal government representing demographically both groups. So to the extent that we can do things like the Fix LA campaign, which we heard about here, and which I'm sure Steve Lerner will talk about this afternoon, for the moment, cities are, on the one hand, the most favorable terrain. On the other hand, it really varies state by state how much legal authority they have to do anything. Birmingham, Alabama passes a minimum wage, creates a minimum wage of $10.10. The state legislature passes a law the next day saying cities can't do this in Alabama. The governor signs it 12 hours after it's passed the legislature. So that's the United States, a depressing prospect. But I would point out a couple of things. In my profession, in journalism, we have seen suddenly a wave of unionization among young people at largely digital media companies, beginning with Gawker. We see polls showing relatively high levels of support for unions among young people. We see polls showing amazingly high levels of support among young people for the word socialism as opposed to the word capitalism. In fact, this has been one of the things I think underlying the unexpected success, relative success of Bernie Sanders. If you look at the odd polls out there showing, things like 39% of people who took part in the Democratic primaries in South Carolina said, yeah, I'm a socialist. I would point out that that's 13% higher than Bernie Sanders' vote. So this is, these things are going on. In the history of public sector unions, I might add, I'll bring up just two names and close with this. In fact, if we want to find the emblematic people who really built public sector unions, as we were talking about in the early 1960s, to people who consider themselves democratic socialists. Jerry Worf, who headed AFSCME first in Chicago, then in New York, then nationally, who was pretty much, by American standards, a left-wing social democrat, and Albert Shanker, who headed the teachers union here and then the National Teachers Union, who by any standard was a right-wing social democrat, nonetheless. So I am encouraged by the odd possibility that we may be seeing, if not a resurgence of whatever American social democracy may be, at least a young electorate which is hopefully willing to push back against the stuff we've been hearing about today. Let's hope. Thank you.